and gentlemen, welcome. This is Ronsley. This is a live recording of Should I Start a Podcast? You will find edited versions of this podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play. Hopefully, I think you should. And it's called Should I Start a Podcast for my business. So if you are a business owner and have a podcast and want to know how to get more listeners, more credibility, more revenue, that's where you go to find that. Today I have an amazing human in the house. I will get to her in a second, but if you didn't know, We Are Podcast 2022 is back for its ninth iteration, Australia's first podcasting conference. I started back in 2015. This year, 10th and 11th of November. Go to wearepodcast.com to check out tickets and who's speaking and all that kind of stuff, all that kind of cool stuff. But today I have Amira in the house, Amira Alvarez, who has a podcast called the Unstoppable Woman Podcast. Now, the word unstoppable is really fascinating because it is, once you start going down the path of being unstoppable, you're like, well, what are the boundaries and what does it mean to be unstoppable, which we're going to get into. She's got over 330 odd episodes that she's published on her podcast, which is an insane amount of reps for a podcaster. So we're going to get into that. And I'm excited to hear about her story and how she started. Amira, welcome to the show.
Super excited to be here too, Ronsley. This is going to be good. I love talking podcast.
Right? I mean, I'm so excited that we get a chance to have this conversation and it gets recorded. We could have easily had this conversation separately, I suppose, and kind of go, hey, how did you work this thing? Because you've got these different, uh, you've been through a journey, you've seen a lot. Let's go back. If you go back and you think about your entrepreneurial journey, what stands out? What is the memory that comes to mind when I ask that question?
In terms of the podcast, the entrepreneurial journey in terms of the
Yeah, in
podcast.
terms of the podcast, in terms of your business, I think in terms of your business, when you look back, what is the entrepreneur moment that stands out?
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think with there's a lot of different moments in growing a business that are really poignant and salient. One of the biggest moments was when I had that sort of come to Jesus moment where at the end of the day, my husband was calling saying, "Hey, dinner's ready." And I was still trying to get one more thing done because I was an entrepreneur and I had a to do list that was never ending. And I didn't know how to self manage. And I was like, "Hey, babe, I'm going to do one more thing and I'll be right down." And it was like an hour later and he started dinner and he didn't guilt or shame me. He was a good guy. Um, but I was like, wait a second, something's not right here. If I am so smart, if I'm such a hard worker, if I've got such a great business, why is this so hard? Why am I hitting a wall and struggling and don't have mastery over myself, my time, my freedom, which is why many of us go into our own business and making money. And I took a really hard look at myself because that evening I had been working all day from crack of dawn until 6:30 at night, and I hadn't showered, I hadn't changed, I hadn't brushed my teeth. Like I was like fully focused, but I wasn't really getting ahead. So that moment was, I would say, my big aha moment with business, that there had to be a different way. And I went and I started to study success and what it takes to actually break through. And I still study success, but I spent a huge amount of time. And that year, like just to connect the dots on that year, I went from making 138K to 700K in 1 year. And that was as a basically solo entrepreneur with one, assistant, virtual assistant. That was a huge breakthrough for me. And I was like, wow, okay. Can I do this again? Can I teach other people to do it? And that in a nutshell is what I've really studied and mastered and teach. And there's a lot to it, but that was the breakthrough moment.
Yeah, like
And it's a lot of what I teach on the podcast too. Like
yeah.
that's like I teach success mindset, success strategies because
Let's
that's near and dear to me.
let's talk about that. Let's talk about success. I, through my journey as an entrepreneur, I've had different variations of the word success and what it means to be successful. And I think even defining it, a lot of us don't even get a chance to define it or get a chance to even think that we can define it. Let's focus on success. What do we need to know, and how can we look at success differently or more in a more holistic way? Probably is a better way of asking that question.
100%. So for me, I'm going to be truly transparent. In that moment, in that year, I was like, okay, I've got to break through. And I set a financial goal. That was what success meant to me in that year. If I could just get here, it was the $1 million mark. If I could make seven figures in a year, I was successful. And that might be a very small minded definition of success, but I will tell you, it hooked me emotionally and it got me out of bed metaphorically. So I would do the hard things that were required of me to grow into the person that I actually wanted to be. And as a result, I felt successful. Now, the goal, the little carrot was the money. And that was really actually quite important to me and was the first layer of success. Now, with 2020 hindsight, I know that what truly feels successful is being having mastery over yourself and understanding what motivates you and how you can actualize the ideas you have into reality. And if you're able to do that, if you understand the process for that, and there's a methodology to it, and when once you get it, it's like, oh, that's repeatable and I can do that, and I know myself well enough that I can then actualize what I want. That to me is what success is, because then you can put it towards freedom, free time, um, great relationships, anything you want,
Of
right?
course, of
And
course.
but the foundation is you trust yourself. You have that self-authority internally.
It's a great point because success could mean different things to different people, and then if you actually start with yourself, it's probably the best way to kind of look at success. So mastery over self, you mentioned that. What do we need to be doing regularly to have mastery over oneself? And I have my version, but I'd love to hear yours first, and then maybe we can jam on that.
Yeah, I'd love that. So I think it starts with self awareness. Like you have to have a level of willingness to look at yourself and in a way that then becomes an applicable plan rather than just navel gazing. So it doesn't work to not look at yourself and think that the outside is the only thing that matters. Really, truly, you are first cause. You are the cause of everything that happens in your life, right? Like you have to understand that the law of cause and effect says for every effect that you want, every result that you want, there is a cause. And the cause before the cause is you. Okay? So who are you being? How are you thinking? How are you showing up? What is the filter with which you see the world and look at the world? Because that's going to uh, determine what opportunities you act on, what you do with your time, how you manage yourself, and you will get different results, whether it's in marketing or sales or the visibility with your podcast or any number of things that are business related. I think it does start with self awareness and then understanding how to take that awareness and apply it to what you want and be willing to change who you're being. So that means you have to change your beliefs about yourself and the way the world works and your identity and self-image in order to not keep doing the same thing you've always done but do something different.
Wow, that was baller. Okay, so I am on 100% on the same page. I feel like one of the things you mentioned, self-awareness, you mentioned filtering the world, and then using that to apply that to something that we want to do. I, for one, had responsibility, which is kind of simple. It's similar to like self-awareness, like taking responsibility of the fact that you wanna understand yourself better. I mean, self being a master of yourself, I suppose, and then having perspective, and then doing the reps to find what that perspective looks like. So that's why the podcast is such a huge component for me in this whole piece, because the part about the podcast that I like a lot is it gets me to refine my argument. So if I'm saying something for a while, I have the like people have the opportunity to kind of go, hey, dude, that doesn't make sense. Explain yourself. Or why did you say it that way? Is there another way to look at it? And maybe there is. And that's why having these conversations are so beautiful for me, actually. They kind of fill me up. And I wonder what the podcast does for you, and how does that fit into Amira's world and Amira's business?
Yeah. Great question, Ronsley. So I just want to affirm first, like the personal responsibility angle, the perspective angle. I use the frame, the law of relativity. I learned these foundational laws of success, and they help me understand how to show up powerfully in this world and make successful decisions. And changing your perspective is such a key component to that. And then what you said about the reps, man, persistence is such a key thing. And putting in the reps is freaking huge, right? You have to put in the reps. I can't say it any other way. You have to just stick with it, and you don't always see the results right away, and you still have to stick with it. That's one of the challenging aspects of being in business and podcasting and all of that, especially with podcasting, right? Like you putting stuff out there, and although you have dialogues with other people on the interview, when you do the interviewing, and we do interviews, I do coach, we do something called Coaching Uncut, which is uh, our clients, some of our clients let us put their coaching calls on the podcast so people can learn from the coaching I'm giving them, which is incredibly generous. And then there's the teaching content that I do. So that there's been reps on all of those. And the coaching content is, there's not a lot of reps on that per se, because I'm fully focused on the coaching, but I put my reps in before. On the podcast, I had to learn how to interview. That was a thing. I had to learn how to be a guest on an interview,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That,
It's
that
a it's
and I
definitely a thing. It's definitely 100% a thing, because and this is something that I speak about a lot. So it's really good to have this perspective. And if you can hear panting in the background, that's my dog. And for whatever reason, I'm having the worst tech day. So excuse the audio. I'm not even sure if everyone can hear the bad audio. But anyway, let's. I think the perspective that you're talking about and the reps that we were kind of getting into is so vital, because we get into a certain way of thinking, and if we don't have a chance to sort of soundboard that, we can't give that perspective to someone else. So having the podcast and being a good interviewer, like you mentioned, is so vital, because we are business owners learning to be podcasters. And after doing this for over a decade and 1,500 interviews in, I still don't listen necessarily properly. I have to like think I missed something right now, and I have that constantly when I'm in a conversation with someone. So I love that you're bringing up interviewing. Let's talk about that. What have you done, and what is your process to be a better interviewer?
honestly, it's listening to other podcasts that I love. I listen to how other people ask questions, and I study what makes that interesting to me. What are they doing that keeps my attention, that sparks my interest, that engages me? And then I think, how could I integrate that into what I'm doing, both format and flow, but also energy wise, who you're being on the podcast and what's the vibe that I like and how can I access my version of that inside of me. So that's one key thing that I've done is I translate what I enjoy into my own my own process, my own pattern. And then, when I teach business owners how to really have a highly authentic, integrated of service sales conversation with a prospective client, one of the things that I'm kind of in their face about is I have this thing. I'm like, shut up and listen, right? I'm just like, come on, shut up and listen. And although I want to add perspective and keep the conversation flowing in the interview process, I really practice being quiet and listening so that I can capture that next thing that I think is going to be an interesting point to follow and explore. And then I'm not afraid to interrupt either. I think there's an art to that.
Of course, it's I remember that when I first started podcasting, I had done over 60 odd interviews or 70 odd interviews, and they were all online at the time. We were using Skype, and I did my first in-person interview with a mayor, and it was so different. And I realized at that point, even though I was doing it in a certain way, every different situation makes it a different situation. It's like you've got to learn to maintain eye contact. You've got to learn to have the question there. It's a I love the art of interviewing because I feel like my only job as a host is to get someone's story right. So to that point, when you look back at your podcast and you look at 300 odd podcasts that you've done, which one stands out and what
Mm.
conversation for you is like, I can't believe I had that conversation?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, when you say 300 odd, I just got word that we're about to drop our 387th episode. That kind of blows my mind. Uh, I'm very I'm very proud of our team for putting that out. Um, you know, Here's the thing. I'm going to speak to visibility and growth. I think that's an important piece to this. The episode that popped for me was an episode I did with someone who I saw on stage at a Tony Robbins event. And so a year or so earlier, I was at this event. Here's this guy who's running the stage for Tony. He's he's got 8,000 people he's talking to, and he was up there and I was in the audience. And then I saw him at the hotel, which was a little odd, and we just kind of nodded at each other and said hello. And then later, I can't remember if our team reached out to him or he reached out to us. That's a little bit of a blur. But I was surprised that he was on the podcast. And we had a freaking blast. And it stands out to me because it was the first time that I had, and it wasn't that long into the podcast, maybe a year and a half into the podcast, where I felt like I had this big name on the podcast and we were riffing and having fun. And he invited me onto his podcast twice. And it was, I felt like I had reached the big time, even though, I'm still growing and I'm nowhere near where, we could be with the podcast. We have big goals and big dreams. But that stood out because I felt like I had crossed a visibility barrier for myself, that I was no longer willing to say I'm not there yet. I'm playing small. Does that make sense?
I would love to get into that. I had different questions until you said that those last few words of playing small. I
Yeah.
had a totally different way I thought this conversation was going to go, but until that point, because I feel podcasting And I'm including everything here in podcasting because the word podcasting has changed because it's a video podcast. It's not only an audio podcast. It's the whole platform, right? It's the whole show, your whole platform, your whole podcast platform. And I feel one of the things that is not spoken about is how deep and intimate it is to actually share your voice and speak your truth. And part of that is playing small. Can you give us can you give us a perspective on how we can not play small? Because in general, I feel we're conditioned to not stand out, don't, be the person that creates the ruckus. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that part.
I think our growth is on the other side of that fear. I think we all have that fear. We are raised with a belief structure that says that's very valid. It's very instinctual that says I am safe if I belong. Right? When we on the savannah or, early paleo years, if you were not part of the tribe, if you were thrown out, you'd be eaten by wolves, right? Like you wouldn't make it. And so we have a deep core belief that's been passed on generation to generation that says, don't stand out. Don't put yourself out there. Just belong. And yet that doesn't make you feel successful. Going back to our original topic of conversation. It's we also want to express ourselves. We also want to be unique. We also want to shine our light in this world. So I think there's this real big push pull between I want to be safe and then we make ourselves small and we don't want to deal with the visibility and we're afraid of making mistakes. We're afraid of putting our foot in our mouths and and I did that with another big name, Ronsley. I just want to go off on a little tangent here. I had another big name on my podcast, and I did all this research on him, and it turns out he was just on a book tour and was going to give me, 20 minutes for dropping the talking points, which was not the best kind of podcast. I don't know if you have ever had that experience where it's not a real conversation; it's just like a talking point. Situation, but I had done all this research. Have you?
I have
Yeah.
totally, and I'll talk about mine, but let you finish your story.
Okay. And so here's this big name, and I'm kind of thrown by how he's just doing this talking points kind of thing. But in the middle, I interject one of the questions that I had prepared, and I'd done all this research, and because the podcast is called The Unstoppable Woman, that's our podcast, and I wanted to understand something about his relationship with his girlfriend, now wife, who helped him move through some bits in his business. And I called her by the wrong name. I'd done all this research, and maybe her name was Michelle, and I called her Melissa, something like that. And uh, he taught me, as aside from the talking points being annoying, right? He taught me in that moment. He's like, "Oh, your audience will love this. It will keep you human to them. They'll eat it up. It will be one of the favorite things that they hear." And that just stuck with me, that I was so concerned with not making a fool out of myself, making a mistake. Not that it came across as like too prim and proper, but I was internally committed to that. And that was just such a big lesson to just roll with it and laugh at yourself and have some humanity, because we are all human and we don't have to show up perfectly to be successful in business. And it's actually one of the things that makes you successful. So
Right,
there you go.
to kind of like, show your real self, I suppose. And everyone talks about authenticity, and let's find a way to create authentic content, and it's exactly that. It's just showing everything and all the parts that you know you don't want other people to know. There are different parts about yourself, and even knowing that there are parts that you know about yourself, there are parts that others see about yourself that you don't know about yourself. There are parts about yourself that others see and you don't know, and no one else knows, and you've got to find out that everyone sees that about you and you're just taking it for granted because it's a thing. And I love that we've gone down this road because you're talking about people, getting people on your podcast. And, when I started this 10 years ago, before my first episodes were even published, I remember interviewing um, Daria Rose, Dr. Daria Rose, who's Kevin Rose's wife. She's a PhD in food. And she said yes to come on this podcast that wasn't even released back then. And I have to say, I haven't thought about that story in a long time until you just told yours. So I thank you for that because I, for 100% fact, know that that gave me confidence. That she said yes. I had that conversation. I was very nervous. Um, I had never done any interviews before, and I have to give credit to the fact that she allowed herself to come on this podcast that had never existed. So I'm very grateful for all those people that have indulged in my little experiments, as I call them, because these are like little experiments, and I show different versions of myself in the sense that I've changed a lot as an entrepreneur and as a podcaster. What has your journey been like, and what do you see as, okay, these are my growth points? You mentioned the 700 k in 1 year, then you went to a million. What has been that journey like when you think, oh, I've had to learn these lessons to get to this step?
Specifically around the podcast or around the business, Ronsley?
Around both. I'm assuming that the podcast is part of the business, is part of the podcast, is part of the
Yeah.
business. So however you want
Yeah.
to look at that, like I feel it supports both. And maybe we start with that. Like how does the podcast fit into the business? And then maybe that follow up with that question.
Yeah, and I'll pull back the curtains on where we're at with the podcast. There's some growing pains around it. I love the podcast. I love doing the content development. Like we do all these different kinds of uh, episodes. We have the, like I said, the guest episodes, the coaching, and then I do these deep dive teaching content pieces because I'm a teacher at heart and I love teaching this material, this how to manage yourself for success, right? Because it's 80% inner game in business. And the podcast has been a great source of clients for us. My marketing team loves it and hates it because you can't really, there's not a lot of back end analytics in the same way that, say, a Facebook ads campaign gives you analytics. So there's a way in which you have to step into receiving, really trust that it's working, come with a perspective like I understand that you'll be compensated according to how much value that you add into this world. And so I start with giving, and this is my way of giving. Like there's so many people who listen to the podcast who will never become a client, but I fill out my, like if you think about this cup, you have to keep, the more you give, the bigger your cup becomes, the more you can receive. And so I keep adding value, I keep giving, and that's my perspective on the podcast. And as a result, people listen to the podcast, they listen to the interviews, they listen to the coaching, they listen to the content. And for those who truly resonate with it, then they do something next with us. And sometimes that's just downloading some additional content that we offer. Sometimes it is because we have great resources for people that we mention. Sometimes it's coming to our summits that we mention. And some people never come, right? Never do the next thing. And that's okay. You have to, it's really taught me that you have to sort of let go of some of that control that you want and trust in the process. So that has, but one of the things that's beautiful about a podcast is that for those loyal listeners who then, decide that they want to work with you, they know you, they come totally warmed up, ready to do the next thing with you. And that makes your job easier in terms of enrollment as a business owner into whatever business you're running. They already have your voice in their head as an expert, and so that makes a huge difference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I love that you've touched on these. You're speaking to the converted almost with the way the podcast works in the business. You mentioned giving. You mentioned value, and more giving equals bigger cup. I feel like people. There are lots of us that know how to give but don't know how to ask. How can we get
Yes.
better at asking? And I felt when you were speaking that this is going to be a question that you'd love to sort of jam on. So
Uh,
let's talk about the ask factor. What
okay.
what what
Can I go off on this a little?
yeah, please
Oh,
go
go on.
off, and also I I have this word called activities, and I got this from Carrie Wilkinson. It's her term, and I feel like business owners need to have these activities in their regular, weekly, daily, monthly sort of reps. If you had to break down activities, what would that be? So maybe you riff and then get to some point where you kind of talk about what are the regular activities that we can do as a business owner or podcaster.
As a podcaster, I'm just going to straight up say it. And we've done this well and not well. Okay? So owning that. Uh ask people to do the next thing with you. And whether that's subscribing, liking, downloading, sharing with friends. All of those are things, very easy things. Doing reviews, those are asks on the podcast that help grow the podcast. In addition, you want to regularly ask for people to take the next step with you. So I will often do a content episode on the podcast and then say, if you want we're going to pull together a worksheet that outlines what I've just taught. If you want to download that worksheet, go to theunstoppablewoman.com/e whatever 387, right? The episode number. And not everyone will do that, but some people will, and they want that next thing, and then they're on your email list. So that's a regular ask for us. And then additionally, we do asks on the podcast, particularly around events that we're doing. Because one thing that I love to do is teach. So we have a 3-day summit called the 7 Laws to Seven Figures Summit, and so we regularly share about that and invite people to come to that. It's not all the time. It's not ridiculous. It's not like push, 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 but you do need to put it out there or nobody knows. You have to let people know what's what's next for them. And some will come, some will not, and it's all good. It's all good. So now can I riff on asking and receiving? Yeah.
Please go, please.
Did you have something on that you wanted to speak to?
No, no, I think you were absolutely on point. I wish you just kept going. So riff on asking, like just keep going. I feel like that was just the foundation for what was to come next. So please keep going.
Okay. So we all have a masculine essence and a feminine essence in us. And the masculine is very directive, it's very linear. It's the part of us that asks, that goes out into the world and hunts. Okay? That's the masculine essence. And so you have to tap into that and be able to ask. Now you also need to tap into your feminine essence, which is what allows you to receive. And you have to be able to open to that. It's like the womb. It's that part that nurtures and receives. And you need to be someone who can tap into both her feminine essence and her masculine essence, or if you're a man, into your masculine essence and your feminine essence. And we all have both in different quantities and in different areas of our life. So a lot of people are really trained to be in their masculine and be able to be very directed action oriented, but don't know how to receive support or to receive money. And both of those things are absolutely critical in business and in podcasting, both, right? And. So you need to the part of me that was talking about, or the when I spoke earlier about saying, you know, there aren't the great analytics. You can have some analytics with podcasting, but you don't have that like really critical data. Like you don't know who's listening in some ways. And you just have to trust that you're supported and that you will receive. That's stepping into your feminine. And that is stepping out of scarcity. That's stepping out of graspiness. That's stepping out of fear. And yet you need to be able to, at the same time, trust but ask. Trust but ask.
Yeah.
So you need both.
I love that you took the asking to the next step, which I do think is very important. Like asking is not the final step, which I sort of alluded to with my question. I think receiving is that step because asking is easy. I suppose people can just ask and rip a band-aid off, just do a half-asked ask, and never be able to receive. And your point is very valid, and I feel like it's a Ronsley therapy session because this whole thing is totally making sense, right? The whole receiving and not being able to receive and kind of feeling really awkward about receiving, even though there's all these instances of people wanting to give and sometimes even without asking. And sometimes the without asking part is really interesting because there are people giving, and because we don't know to receive, um, not talking about me. I'm speaking for a friend, really. Uh, we can't see them as gifts. How can we change perspective a little bit, right? And kind of maybe see that in a way that, or pay more attention. How do we catch ourselves? Is there a method that you have to this madness?
Yes. So one thing that I just want to give you right off the top of my head right now is that in the ask you also want to be giving. Okay? So, and this is as much of an intellectual and strategic perspective as an inner shift for you. So when I invite someone to the summit, or I invite someone to download resources on our success page, I know internally that it's going to help them so much, that it's a gift to them. It's of service to them. That's my come from energy on the inside, not just as an intellectual concept. So when I say, hey, do you want to come to the summit? Or hey, if you want this download, please go to our success page, right? Whatever I'm saying, I have a come from energy that is embedded in that ask, that I'm giving something stupendous, really amazing, tremendous, extraordinary. And that doesn't come from a lack of humility. It comes from a recognition that we all have our unique genius. This is mine, and it doesn't serve anyone if I make myself small, like we were talking about. So I need to own my greatness and share it in a way that really demonstrates that the power that's behind it, and that will be of service to other people. So you can get beyond this by recognizing that even though there's a strategy there, right? When someone downloads something for us, they're on our email list, then we stay in touch that way, right? Like there's a strategy for that. But even on the email list, we keep giving amazing teaching content, resources, all of this sort of stuff. What's not to love? Like if you want to scale your business, I got the goods, right?
Right.
Like that's my attitude.
Right.
So
I
it's
think that
wrapped up in one.
I think that idea of really owning our greatness is part of the giving, part of the receiving. I love how this has all come full circle to the whole self mastery part that we started speaking about at the start of the conversation. And you keep mentioning podcast stats and how podcast stats are different, I suppose. So I wanted to speak a little bit about that for a second, because a podcast listen is not like any other form of like content that exists out there. Every other form, especially if it's audio only, especially if you're consuming this. I know a lot of, it's really interesting because I just started doing these lives and the recordings live, in which then the team takes this and edits this down, and it becomes a very fully edited podcast, which is half the length of this entire live, which is fascinating. But the podcast is the engagement part of the attention and sales. So the know, like, and trust. The podcast is the like factor, and no other form of content you can consume while you're doing other things. Everything else, you got to stop what you're doing to consume it. So the 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 listen you get on a podcast is very different to a swipe of a reel or a click on a Facebook ad or someone watching a video or reading a blog post. Very different to someone listening and being plugged, having your voice plugged into their ears. Because when you think about it, who would you rather buy from? Someone that has sent you a bunch of emails, or someone that you've listened to for the last half hour. And there's the reason why parents sing to their kids and talk to their kids even before they're born. This voice has a very deep impact. So I think, to your point, as being having a bit of perspective as a podcaster around podcast stats is really vital, because what ends up happening is that we get caught up in the downloads. And if I every week had 100 people that I could talk to, I would be very grateful. But for some reason, 100 listeners a week is not a grateful amount for a new podcaster who's never done a podcast in their life before. It's really weird how we have these boundaries that we put on ourselves. So maybe I'd love for you to talk about that, because I think that is your jam. The idea that we put these little boundaries and we stop ourselves, right? And we want to be more unstoppable. And I suppose the starting point is removing the boundaries.
Yeah, it's removing the boundaries, and in this perspective, it's understanding where you're going and what it's going to take to get you there. And can we turn the tables and give you the mic for a moment, or again, because you're the expert in building the podcast. My strategy has been give good content, do it consistently, do it 3 times a week, put it out there, and love what I'm doing. That's been my strategy. Okay, maybe a little bit more than that, but full transparency, you know, it's been a wing and a prayer a little bit, and we just recently hired a you know people who know better than we do to manage the podcast, and that's been a learning curve because they're not perfect either, and it's an evolution. So I really think, I mean, my big thing around the numbers there, Ronsley, personally, is like I look at them, I don't have a comparison mark, except I can go, okay, well, so and so has this many downloads, maybe I need that many downloads. But like it's ridiculous, and that's where people like you come into play, because I know for my clients, when they tell me like open rates or download, like conversion rates from webinars, I'm like, you're doing great, and they're like, really? I thought I sucked. And there was like, no, you have no idea in the industry
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah.
So
Let, let, let me
yeah.
speak to that for a second, because I feel the first most important metric any podcaster needs to look at is the reps, how many episodes they have published. Hands down, that is the most important number. The next number from that is how many people have replied back to you, right? If you want to really keep track of the proper number, and this is why even one person replying back is amazing, is like a great thing.
What do you mean by reply back? Like making a comment in a
Yeah,
podcast?
yeah, like
Okay.
someone engaging with your content, which is probably one of the big mistakes that business owners don't do. They do lots of call to actions, but no call to engagements. And that's why having call to engagements in your podcast is vital. And we don't know that. We're not podcasters by trade, right?
I need I needed to hear that, Ronsley. Totally needed to hear that.
That's
Oh my God, owning that. Okay.
that
Thank
is
you.
so funny. I mean, I wanted to talk about that as initially, like I thought to myself that I wanted to cover call to engagements in this episode, so it really happened to be amazing that it happened in the conversation. But call to engagements is when someone engages with your content that they're listening to at this moment, which is for me gold. And I find that people are listening to this and commenting on this whole live video towards the end, or like watching parts of it and saying, hey, I thought you were asking these questions for me, which is so amazing and so fascinating. And the edited version of this podcast, which gets cut down and rearranged, becomes consumable, becomes like a chapter in a book, will get released in February because this is just a recording, but it's still going live everywhere, and you've connected your socials. And I find that this method of doing it allows for more spontaneity, but also separating the recording process from the publishing process, but still having visibility right through. But the key is to kind of go, well, if you're still watching and this is still making sense, what is landing right now? Like, what have we spoken about all this time that is making most sense to you? And that is gold, because we don't know what's landing with people, right? And getting that perspective as a host is like, I pay $100 for each one of those perspectives, to be honest. And the next really important metric is, who am I interviewing who has my target market but no competitive overlap? They do different things to what I do, but they have the same audience, and I want to co-create with them. You're a great example, right? I want to co-create with you for my audience, because what you bring is not something that I would bring to the conversation. And I'm
Can
in my,
can
yeah,
I ask you a question about that?
please.
I would love your perspective. So, because I have gone back and forth and like I've had to do my internal work on this. There are a lot of amazing uh, women entrepreneurs who are either in the same lane as me or very close. So you could say that they're competition, and I put that in quotes. Uh, and I've really worked on my internal game not to be in competition, to work on the creative plane. So can you talk to me about whether I've been uh, naive, stupid about that, like in terms of having people that are in the same, in theory that we're not. I love doing podcasts like this because we're not in the same exact lane. But like, what do you think about
Yeah.
the like being in the same lane with someone?
I think that's the next step, and I love the abundance mindset. I think having that attitude in general is really good. However, to create for an audience that loves a perspective, right? That you care about, because you're doing it in a certain way and you're doing it different to everyone else. Now I'm in a unique position that not no one really is doing podcaster business owners. Very
Mhm.
specific. There's very it's very there are different people talking about monetizing a podcast, but no one's really kind of helping business owners that have a podcast grow their business using a podcast. So for me, it's different. But then for a coach, the first thought is like, oh, I have all these other coaches that I can interview. However, if we step back a bit and kind of went, who has the market but doesn't do what we do, we open parallels that other people can't open, right? Which are,
Yeah.
for example, as a coach, website developers, portrait photographers, co-working spaces. Those are places that people don't even think about straight off the bat, right? And again, if you create like progressive accountants, progressive lawyers for entrepreneurs, like when
Mhm.
you think about that, you're going, hold on, I can create a podcast that is not only about coaching, not only about a certain way of thinking or a certain mindset way, but a way that benefits my audience, just like you're saying, in a giving manner, through having all these other partners as part of my process. And then it's very simple to go, can I do a training to your people? Or like,
Mhm.
that's just the logical next step. So that's why I say start with same target market, no competitive overlap, because then you start creating a unique show that not everyone can create because they're not even thinking on those lines. Is that landing? Does that make sense?
Yeah. 100%. And I love how you did your engagement CTA there. I'm picking up on what you're putting down. And I would say that our best, like to your point about how to build a podcast that builds your business, some of our best clients have come through, you know, being a guest and doing sort of a podcast swap with people who do speaking, speaking around coaching, or they are interior designers, or they're photographers, and these are the things that my clients are interested in, my audience is interested in also. So lawyer, that sort of vision that you've set, I just want to affirm that has totally worked for us
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
growth strategy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
amazing. Well, I can keep talking to you, and I love that we can keep going. I had other things that I wanted to cover, but I'm not going to cover this. So if you're watching this live and you wanted to look at the mistake that I was going to cover, number 68, I'm probably going to cover that in another episode. So, but if you want the whole list, mistakes.wearepodcast.com. It's a bunch of mistakes that business owners make with their podcast, and we've got the top 10 and how to avoid them and how to fix them. So go get that. But Amira, before we wind this up and land this plane, where can people find more about you and your work, and how can they connect with you?
Absolutely. So I'm on all the social media channels, both as Amira Alvarez and the Unstoppable Woman. That's the name of the company. And the podcast is called The Unstoppable Woman. And that is on all the platforms. So wherever you like to listen, please check that out. And then we have a ton of resources on, I mentioned some of these laws that I really use to adjust my thinking and scale to seven figures. So we have trainings on that. If you go to theunstoppablewoman.com/success, you will get access to those trainings. We have sales trainings, we have uh, inner game thinking trainings, we have how to scale your business trainings. So tons of, I know that's a lot to take in, but if you're interested in these laws in particular, that's a great place. So theunstoppablewoman.com/success.
So amazing. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And ladies and gentlemen, go check out the podcast. Episode 196 was me. I was on the Unstoppable Women podcast. Insane. But thank you for having me. Go check that out the podcast. Make sure you review and rate it if you do land up listening. Amira, thank you for this conversation, for the time, for allowing me for this therapy session, a Ronsley therapy session. So I appreciate you, and we'll catch each other soon. I'm hoping so. Thank you so much.